Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event hosted today by the Political Economy Research Centre at Goldsmiths. I'm delighted to be joined today by Brett Christophers, and we're going to be talking about his superb new book, which is Rentier Capitalism: Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It? Brett is a professor in the Department of Social and Economic Geography at University of Uppsala in Sweden, and he's one of those scholars who seems to produce rapidly changing and empirically rich analyses of a wide range of topics. His books in recent years have included The Great Leveller, which looks at the legal conditions of capitalism, which was published in 2016, The Great Enclosure on land privatization in 2019, and his book, which just came out last month with Verso, which is this one, Rentier Capitalism. But he's also put out some really fascinating research over recent years on topics such as the way the financial community calculates the risk of climate change, inequalities in housing wealth, and matters of intergenerational inequality. So I'm really delighted to welcome Brett to today's event. The way we're going to do this today is we're going to have a dialogue about some of the topics of the book for about half an hour or so. And while that goes on, please keep yourselves muted. You can add questions to the chat box. And then we'll have about half an hour where we will select some people from those questions to put their microphones on, their cameras on if they wish, and ask some questions to Brett. So anyway, welcome Brett, and thanks very much for joining us today. And first of all, congratulations on this superb book. It's a really outstanding piece of empirical and theoretical analysis. And as we were just saying before this discussion started, I think it's one of those books that's actually going to stand the test of time, because there's been quite a lot of discussion of rentier capitalism in recent years, but I don't know of anything that has successfully managed to put quite so much kind of empirical and careful critical flesh on the bones of the core critique of rentier capitalism that has become, particularly in the context of Piketty's work, has become quite plausible in recent years. But I just thought maybe the best way for us to start would be for you to explain what a rentier is and what rentier capitalism means, because these are terms that have been thrown around, and your book outlines some of the dominant definitions, but yours is quite distinctive.
Yeah, so thanks. First of all, thanks, Will, for arranging this, and thanks everybody for tuning in who's out there. I recognise a couple of familiar names and faces, so that's nice. So yes, I mean, actually one of the motivations for writing the book was precisely that. Although there is has been a lot of stuff in recent years said and written about rent and about rentiers and about the rentier economy, it seemed to me that a lot of it was fairly abstract and free floating, and that there was a lack of sort of both definitional clarity and also empirical flesh on it. And so the book tries to do both of those things. In terms of definitions, I think this is probably one of the areas where a lot of kind of critical attention will potentially be focused, because what I do is while the definition that I use is rooted primarily in what I refer to as the heterodox tradition of thinking about rent, it also draws to a certain extent on more mainstream approaches to rent. And so, very briefly, there's quite a significant difference between those two traditions in terms of how they understand and think about rent. So in the heterodox tradition, rent is essentially seen as a type of income that is based upon the ownership or control of a scarce asset of some kind. So the asset is kind of front and center. Whereas for mainstream economists, they think about rent very, very differently. So there might be an asset involved, but equally there might not be. So there, rent is essentially the excess profit that is based upon a lack of competition. So if we think of kind of normal profits as the profit that's obtainable in the context of market competition, then rent is the excess profit that is available by dint of an absence of competition. And so the way I approach rent in the book is by leaning primarily on the heterodox tradition, saying absolutely I understand rent in terms of ownership or control of a scarce asset of some kind, but I also say that there's something significant in the mainstream approach, which is its focus on the market conditions under which that rent is earned. And so I basically say that rent is based upon asset control of some kind, but it's rent that's being earned under conditions where there's a lack of market competition. And so I kind of draw on both of those traditions. And what the book does is says, look, there's a whole series of different types of assets out there today, of much greater variety than was the case, say, when people like Ricardo and Marx and others were writing about rent, when it was basically land and financial assets that were being talked about then. And what I say is that a rentier is essentially any economic actor that is earning, whose income generating capacity is largely or predominantly based upon the earning of rents. And a rentier can be of two different types, essentially. So traditionally, people tend to think of rentiers in terms of individuals, so kind of wealthy, typically lazy individuals who are earning their rents without the investment of any labor of any kind. What I argue in the book is that today, the vast bulk of rents are actually earned by companies rather than individuals. And so while the book is about rents being earned both by households or individuals on one hand and companies on the other, it's primarily about corporate rents. And actually that's one of the main arguments of the book, is that if you want to understand rent and rentierism, you need to focus on companies and corporate rentierism as well as individual rentierism. So if a rentier is an economic actor whose income is based largely or predominantly on the earning of rents, Rentier Capitalism, which is obviously the title of the book, is an economy which is dominated by rent and rentiers. It's an economy where the earning of rent is a significant or arguably the most significant component of that economy, and where rentiers of various descriptions are the most powerful actors within that economy. And the argument is that the UK is this kind of quintessential case of rentier capitalism. But what I hope is that, at least, is that some of the arguments of the book are also applicable to one extent or another more broadly than just within the UK.
Sure, thanks. Well, that gives us a kind of clear definitional premise with which to kind of start to unpack some of the examples that the book is concerned with, and you mentioned land and financial assets there, which were things which existed in the time of Ricardo and Marx, but can you start to talk us through some of the different genres of rents? Because the organization of the book is primarily, a lot of the substance of the book is in terms of these different is a kind of taxonomy of rents.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So again, going back to kind of the motivation for the book, one of the things I've noticed in the recent discussions of rent was two things. So one was that there were the range of assets that people tended to invoke when talking about rent was relatively narrow, and also that it was the same examples that would come up again and again. And so land and property assets were obviously a classic example. Pharmaceutical patents would be another classic example. But the range was relatively narrow. And so what I wanted to do with the book was first of all, kind of impart some clarity to in taxonomic terms, as you suggest, but just also make the case that there's actually a really broad range of assets out there today on which private actors are earning significant levels of rental income. So as you say, financial assets and land are two, and there are five others that I discuss at length in the book. So one of those is natural resource assets. So I talk a lot about both mineral resources, but also other raw materials of other natural resources of various kinds, and make the point that those are significant rent generating assets, not just for the rentier states who are typically discussed in terms of natural resource rents, the petrostates and so on, but also significant capitalist institutions are obviously major earners of natural resource rents as well. So natural resources is one category. Intellectual property is another category, which obviously includes pharmaceuticals, but extends far beyond pharmaceuticals into, the creative industries and other, consumer goods manufacturers and other parts of the economy. So we're talking there about patents, talking about trademarks, and we're talking about copyright. So intellectual property rentiers is the fourth category. The fifth one I talk about is platform rents. And so there I'm talking in large part about digital platforms, but not only digital platforms. And so there I make the argument that platforms are earning primarily intermediation-based rent. So the primary economic basis on which platforms, whether digital or otherwise, earn rents is the fact that they are intermediating trade between buyers and sellers of various different varieties, and they're able to cream off rents by virtue of playing that powerful intermediary role. And so then that's five categories, and the two others, the penultimate category is infrastructure rents. I was worrying for a second now, I was actually going to forget what the seven were. So infrastructure rents, so that's where the rentier is the owner or controller of an infrastructure that is crucial to service delivery of some kind. So that can be a telecommunications infrastructure, would be a classic example of that. So Openreach in the UK would be a very, very good example. But it could be the owner of water and wastewater infrastructures. It can be the owner of the electricity and gas transmission and distribution networks, where the ownership of that infrastructure enables that owner to earn a rent by charging third parties to access and use that infrastructure for the delivery of their services. So infrastructure rents is the penultimate category. And then the last category, and I guess there's a reason I've left it to last, is what I refer to as contract rents, which is where the key asset is the ownership of a long-term contract of some kind, either for the delivery of services to the public sector or to the private sector. And it's here that I talk about kind of the massive move towards outsourcing by the public sector in the UK in recent decades, where you have this whole kind of breed of companies that has grown up, whose job is winning contracts. That's their primary job. And as I think, there's a whole host of, of stories that have shown that actually for many of these companies, the actual fulfilling of those contracts is very much kind of a secondary consideration. And so if you look at the balance sheets of these companies, then what you see is that the key assets that they identify are precisely these long-term contracts, 5, 10, 15, or even 20-year contracts, of which PFI contracts are one notable variety for the delivery of these long-term services. And the only other point I want to make here before finishing is that the contract example is a good example to illustrate a wider point I make in the book, which is that essentially very few, if any, of these assets kind of earn rents in and of themselves. In almost all of these cases, if not all of these cases, work needs to be done to kind of put these assets to work and to enable them to generate rents for their owners. And that the degree of work that is required can vary quite a lot from one extreme, property assets, where the landlord doesn't have to do a great amount of work to enable that property asset to generate rents, to the other extreme, these contract assets, where often significant amounts of work are required to enable those assets to generate rents.
Yeah, so I was thinking you could have a sort of 7 days of Christmas with the different rentiers for each one, but you try and get yourself through to remember all 7 of them. So one of the things which I think you've already kind of touched on there is the fact that there's no absolutely hard and fast division between sort of how capitalism should be, where it's all kind of based around some kind of, production of value, whether viewed critically or otherwise. And then there's this sort of, as you say, the kind of image of the kind of lazy rentier, and that actually these two things kind of sort of blend in various ways. So as your example of the contract rents indicates, there's sometimes quite a lot of work that needs to be done in order to extract the rents. And I think that that's kind of one important kind of thing that the book really stresses is to try and get away from the image of a particular kind of leisure class, I suppose, of someone who basically just has a kind of portfolio of assets and then various sort of things kind of come their way. Whereas, of course, that's not how the UK economy at large works. So, I mean, in that sense, I suppose this poses a kind of political and normative question, which is, what is wrong with this then? Because clearly, if this is something which, as you show in the book, and I mean, the book has got quite a lot of evidence for the fact that actually this is that rent seeking is actually a dominant feature of UK capitalism in terms of the companies that dominate the FTSE and this sort of thing. So what is wrong with this? What are the social harms that this generates?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So you're right, the book is definitely a critique of rentier capitalism. It isn't just a kind of, empirical description of what rentier capitalism looks like, although I would say that that's a significant contribution of the book, is kind of just literally putting the empirical flesh on the bones. And I wanted that to be a big part of what the book is about, but it is a critique. But as you also say, what it isn't is the type of critique which, Piketty aside, we can come back to, and I can and will come back to Piketty. Piketty aside, I would say the other critiques that have been, most influential in recent years and most high profile about rent and the rentier capitalism tend to be what I would refer to as moral economic critiques. And they are absolutely about drawing these distinctions, which I argue are actually pretty hard to draw, between kind of the deserving productive capitalist on the one hand and sort of the undeserving rentier capitalist on the other. And I'm thinking in particular about the work of people like Guy Standing, Mariana Mazzucato, and Andrew Sayer. They're the three books that I principally refer to in setting up my account and in distinguishing my account from those. I would say those are predominantly moral economic critiques, and I don't go down that road at all. I for various different reasons, I avoid going down that road. Partly because I'm far from convinced that the productive capitalist is necessarily deserving of their surplus value either. So to the extent that the book is a critique, it's a critique. It's a political economic critique, and it's a critique of not of kind of the essential nature of the rentier, but of what the dominance of rentier capitalism leads to. And what I argue in the book is that there are kind of two sets of connected deleterious consequences from the dominance of rentier capitalism. And so one of those is an argument about kind of investment and productivity. And it's basically an argument that a rentier economy is ultimately a stagnant economy. It's an economy, because, and we can come back to this, but because there are various incentives in place that basically incentivize rentiers to kind of sweat their existing assets through things like patent extension and so on and so forth, rather than investing time and money in the production of new products and services. It tends to be a very stagnant economy in which you get low levels of investment, low levels of research and development. All the data bearing all of that out in relation to the UK economy. Low levels of investment and innovation, and because of that, you get declining labour productivity, insufficient capital investment, and so it's just basically this kind of stagnant economy on the one hand. And so I talk about that, but the other thing I talk about probably more in the book is how a rentier economy is almost kind of a perfect breeding ground for high levels of inequality, and I talk, and this is where kind of the connection to Piketty comes back, because I think that's precisely what a lot of his book is about. Really, he doesn't necessarily use the terms that I use, but basically his whole kind of R over G formula is a formula about rent. His R, which is kind of the return on assets, is a rent metric, and his argument is that if you have low levels of G, low levels of growth, which I've just said is what you end up with in a rentier economy, combined with high levels of return on existing assets, which is precisely what you have in the UK, because of the various incentives that are in place in terms of generous tax treatments of different forms of rents on intellectual property and other assets. That's precisely the formula that creates high levels of wealth inequality, according to Piketty. So R over G is what you have in the UK. So you have a kind of a perfect machine for the creation of wealth inequality. At the same time, you have also a mechanism for the creation of high levels of income inequality, and there are various reasons I point to for that, but I'll point to just two of them here. So one of them is that rentier institutions tend to be very unequal institutions internally. So you have particularly high, and I talk about some of the data showing this in the book, you have particularly high discrepancies between people at the top end of the income hierarchy within companies and people at the bottom end within rentier institutions. But the other thing, obviously, is that in a rentier economy, you have people at the top end of the income hierarchy supplementing their employment from income, supplementing their income from employment, with supplementing with income from assets, predominantly financial assets and property assets. And so you have the high levels of income inequality combining with high levels of wealth inequality. So those are the two broad sets of implications that I talk about in terms of why rentier capitalism is bad. On the one hand, it leads to stagnation, low levels of investment, low levels of growth and innovation. On the other hand, it's this kind of perfect breeding ground for the propagation of both wealth and income inequalities. Will, you're muted.
I'm muted. Sorry.
Yeah.
You started to talk about some of the policy mechanisms there, and this brings us to the topic of neoliberalism, which is something that you talk about in the book, because the book accepts the concept of neoliberalism. It ultimately is prepared to go along with the idea that this is really a symptom of neoliberalism, although it's not a term I think you're hugely invested in. But obviously, Piketty's big kind of resurgence of inequality starts precisely at the moment when the likes of Margaret Thatcher get into power and Ronald Reagan and so on. And this is, in some ways, this book casts a different light back upon those reforms, because all of the rhetoric was, of course, about enterprise, entrepreneurship, a hard day's work, responsibility, all that kind of rhetoric. And then this book is a very damning indictment of the fact that actually it's about kind of clever lawyers and clever sort of agents and people who are smart at managing to kind of prolong property rights and restrict access and this sort of thing. So I think it's a damning indictment of 40 years of Thatcherite reforms and similar. What would you say are some of the main policy instruments that enabled that to happen? And as a sort of side note, I mean, do you think any of that was kind of deliberate? I mean, was there a sort of was this kind of planned in the way that someone like Philip Murawski might see neoliberalism as being kind of plotted in some respects? But start with the first bit of that question.
Yeah, the second bit of the question is probably the harder bit. Yeah. So the first, I mean, you're right. So I do make the argument in the book that the kind of the series of policies, measures, interventions of other kinds that we refer to typically as neoliberalism is precisely what has put in place the conditions for the emergence of a rentier economy. So that's exactly the argument I make. And so therefore precisely the reason why the UK is kind of this kind of epitome of a rentier economy is precisely because it's a place or the place where neoliberal reforms have been pursued to their to the nth degree. So I guess what I argue is that if you want to think about the different sets of measures that have been taken that have made the UK a particularly bounteous place for the rentier, there are four main areas. So the first of one of the first reason, and in a way the simplest reason why the UK is sort of the heartland for rentierism is simply that there are so many assets out there to earn rents on. And obviously one of the reasons for that is privatization. So the UK has gone further down the privatization road than arguably anywhere else. It's there's almost nothing left to privatise in the UK. And all of those assets of various kinds that have been privatised, be it, ranging from land and property through, in terms of right to buy, all the way through to infrastructures of water and wastewater delivery and telecommunications networks and so on. Those are all today prominent rent generating assets of various kinds for the private sector. Even many of the right to buy houses that were originally bought by sitting council house tenants are now within the private rental sector. And so privatisation is the first reason for this. There's more, why in the UK? Because there's more assets out there. The second reason is that those assets in the UK tend to be better protected from competition than in various other places. And so that, one example of that would be things like intellectual property assets. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that, there is these great studies that are done by, the champion, trade bodies, intellectual property trade bodies will produce these indices every year, and they say, what are the top 10 territories for the enforcement of intellectual property rights? And the UK is always number 1 or 2 on the list, because those are the UK is a place where intellectual property is better protected from potential infringement of various kinds than anywhere else in the world. Those assets, in other words, are better protected from potential competition than anywhere else, and are therefore able to generate rents with a greater degree of security than in other places in the world. So the second thing is there's more assets, they're better protected from competition. And natural resource concessions would be another very good example of that, and one that I'll come back to actually when I answer the second part of your question. The third reason is that those assets, as well as being better protected, they also more readily generate income than in other places. And one of the things I return to again and again in the book is tax policy. And so one of the arguments I make is that not only is tax policy in general in the UK very friendly towards rentiers, principally in terms of friendly capital gains tax policies, but also within different individual rentier sectors, there are particularly favourable tax treatments. Again, natural resources being the best example. So the level of taxation of hydrocarbon production in the UK historically, so talking here particularly about North Sea oil and gas production, historically has been much lower levels of taxation of royalties being extracted by the state than anywhere else in the world. Intellectual property again, something I talk about in the book is the so-called patent box, which means that if you are generating corporate profits through the utilization of intellectual property of any kind, but in particular patents, you pay a lower rate of corporation tax than on other forms of corporate profit. Creative industries tax reliefs, so on and so forth. So across all of these sectors, there are hugely beneficial tax treatments that mean, as well as these assets being better protected, they're able to generate tax-free or very low tax rents better than in other countries. And then last but not least, and this is something that Piketty talks about as well, is that you have an environment that for a long time has been very conducive to asset price inflation, not least through quantitative easing and post-financial crisis monetary policy of various kinds, but also prior to the financial crisis as well. You have an environment that is incredibly conducive to the inflation of asset prices of various kinds. So you put all that together, and you create this kind of one Financial Times journalist who wrote this great article that was related to this called a rentier's paradise, and that's exactly what the UK has become through this kind of bundle of different treatments of various kinds.
Sure.
And so you're absolutely right that stands in stark contrast to kind of the rhetoric and discourse that has always gone along with what we call neoliberal reforms in the UK. Mm-hmm. Was that purposeful? I'm sure that it was. I'm sure that it was to a certain extent. One of the things I talk about in the book is when the North Sea oil concessions were being set up in the 70s, and when they were being relicensed in the early 1980s, one particular conservative politician, I think he was the energy minister, I can't remember his name, said, well, you know, shouldn't we be trying to introduce more competition into this sector than we have at the moment? And he was kind of you know, robustly put in his place, where effectively he was kind of told, well, we say that privatization is about competition, but that's not really what it's about at all. So I think it's quite clear, if you look into the details of it, that to a certain extent or another, to one extent or another, the favouring of rentiers was part and parcel of this in the first place. But I personally don't believe that you know, Thatcher in particular would necessarily look favourably upon the nature of the British rentier economy that we have today. I think there are various aspects of it probably that wouldn't necessarily have pleased her at all.
Yeah, I mean, there are figures such as Wolfgang Streeck and others as well who've looked at how neoliberalism was a kind of social movement from above, in a way, that it was the sort of coordination of capital to increase its profit margins, which or David Harvey for that matter. And the question, I suppose, is the extent to which that is a kind of conscious project, and to what extent it's simply a sort of almost a kind of you know, something that somehow kind of sort of leaks into the political classes in various ways, as many histories of neoliberalism have explored. I have more questions. I want to encourage people, because it's now we've been chatting about half an hour now, and I want to encourage people to put some questions for Brett in the chat box. And I was going to conclude with a question about what is to be done, and there is actually quite a lot in the book about that. So I do encourage people, if anyone wants to move on to that topic, please do use the chat for that. But since there's nothing there right at this moment, I want to just kind of ask you one more question, which is about law, because you've written in your book, The Great Levelers, about the role of law in capitalism, and there's a lot of law in the under rentier capitalism. Law does a lot of work. I mean, it obviously does work in intellectual property rights. It obviously does work in what you call the contract rentier economy. But then, of course, you know, even derivatives are effectively kind of paper contracts. And there were times when I was reminded of Katharina Pistor's work in the Code of Capital, which is her book that is a kind of touchstone for what's now called the law and political economy movement. I was wondering to what extent you thought law maybe plays a kind of an exceptional role in this, and whether lawyers themselves play an exceptional role in this, because a lot of your examples in some ways come back to the ability to do what Pistor says is to shield assets in certain ways, and also to shield income streams. And that ultimately is something that, of course, I suppose some of these platforms are using effectively sort of pure kind of contingency, pure violence almost. If you're using something like digital rights management, it's just, I do it because I can do it. But a lot of the time it's actually founded in a kind of, in the taking of law and repurposing it for particular private ends.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I do talk about law in the book, and I do, as you say, I do talk about it on a sort of sporadic basis. So I do talk about it in relation to specific types of assets and the work that the law does, principally in terms of kind of shoring up the defences around those assets and making sure that the property rights associated with those assets are strong ones. You know, so one of the things I've been doing, I've been working on since the book, is I did this lecture for the Historical Materialism Conference, where I tried to think about the relationship between class and assets and inequality under Rentier capitalism, and in particular in that lecture, I tried to look at the question of, you know, how different people in different occupations within the workforce are kind of differentially positioned vis-a-vis these different types of assets. And one of the categories I looked at there was lawyers. And I guess one of the reasons I did this was there was a piece that David Graeber wrote. It must have been relatively soon, you know, relatively shortly before he died, where he came up, and maybe he made this observation in a previous piece, but in this particular piece, he observed that one of the notable things about the UK economy is that proportionally there are more lawyers than almost anywhere else, and there are more accountants than anywhere else. And in that particular piece, the argument that I can't remember what his actual argument was, but his argument for why that's the case struck me as not being particularly persuasive. And to me, the answer for why there are more lawyers and accountants in the UK than elsewhere is precisely because it's a rentier capitalist economy. And in a rentier capitalist economy, you need lawyers to do that work on assets of making sure those assets are properly protected and are able, to withstand competitive threats of various different kinds, such as intellectual property infringement. And you need accountants, equally importantly, you need accountants to be able to perform or show the value of those assets within the accounts of those companies to make those companies investable by the investor community. So both accountants and lawyers play a particularly significant role, I think, within rentier capitalism. Yeah. And to me, that explains precisely why there are so many accountants and lawyers in the UK, is because it's a rentier capitalist economy. So I think that's one possible answer to your question.
Yeah, right. We've got quite a few questions now. I was wondering maybe we could start with the one at the top, which is from, apologies for my pronunciation, but Ali Pasha, would you like to ask your question yourself about antitrust? If you turn your microphone on, or I can read it out. The question is, what was the impact of antitrust regulations on this issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. Antitrust or competition law, competition policy, plays a really important part in the book and in the story. It's obviously not the whole story, but it's definitely a part of it. And so there's two things I'd say about that. So first of all is that within various sectors that I talk about in the book, it's quite clearly the case that a lack of enforcement of competition law has been part of the reason for why the rentiers that I discuss in the book are subject to so little, to the relatively limited amount of competition that they are subject to. Now, some of the most interesting examples, I think, are sectors where, it actually can be quite hard for there to be competition. So the classic example there would be some of these infrastructure rents, where, for example, within the context of telecommunications networks, water and wastewater networks, these are ultimately natural monopoly infrastructures. At the same time, though, more could have been done, clearly, to introduce and to encourage competition in those sectors than the UK government and UK regulators have done. And so that's one of the arguments I make in the book, is that more could have been done. And you only have to look at, the decisions that were made on various telecommunications mergers historically to see that. Think about satellite broadcasting, B-Sky, what's today's Sky was originally two satellite broadcasters back in the early 1990s. That merger was waved through creating a de facto monopoly. NTL and Telewest, the two cable companies, merger waved through, creating a de facto monopoly. So across the board within telecommunications, antitrust failed within the UK. And it also failed in relation to intellectual property. Different competition law regimes internationally take very, very different views on the nature of intellectual property, whether it does represent a monopoly, and if so, how competition law should treat those assets. Again, the UK is at the extreme in terms of being very, 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 very favourable towards the exercise of monopoly in relation to intellectual property. Yeah. And so just to conclude that answer to that question, one of the 3 or 4 things that I point to in the book that potentially could be done in terms of kind of policy avenues or solutions to kind of de-rentierize the UK economy is precisely about competition law.
Right. Could I ask, this is going down a few questions, I'm not taking them in chronological order. Veit Braun, would you like to ask your question, or I can read it out? It's changing gears a little bit, and I thought that might be an interesting different sort of perspective on
Yes,
on
yes, sure, I can ask it. Thank you. I'm aware of the problem that whenever you try to Thank you very much for the book, first of all. So one of the problems, I think, in tackling this whole problem of the rentier economy and the inequalities that stem from it is that when you try to address it by, for example, raising inheritance tax or capital income tax, then a lot of the people who would actually profit from it will screech and tell you, no, this is actually not what we want. Because when I get that, I don't know, 30,000 quid inheritance from my grandma, I don't want it to be taxed at all. And I don't care how much you tax my labor, actually, if you take away 30–40% of my labor income. But my rentier income, I don't want you to touch that at all. And this protects, in a way, in an unholy alliance, the real rentiers of the economy. So I'm wondering what you make of that. And I'm seeing that also in the UK, not just in continental Europe, but I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I tried to get into that a little bit in the conclusion to the book, where as well as highlighting what I think are some of the potentially progressive ways forward, I also talk about what some of the likely obstacles to the enactment of those progressive way forwards are likely to be. And one of the things I point to is precisely that, which is the fact that and Rutger Bregman wrote a really nice piece on this a couple of years ago in The Guardian, where he had an article where he I can't remember the exact words he put it, but he said, one of the big problems is that, we all want to be rentiers today. By which he basically meant that many of us are invested in the rentier economy. Some of us through being owners of our own properties, and potentially in a reasonably large number of cases of second properties as well, but also through the ownership of financial assets of various kinds, not least in terms of pensions. And you only really have to look at what happened when prior to the last UK election, Labour commissioned that Land for the Many report that George Monbiot and a series of others co-authored, and how the right-wing press in the UK kind of latched onto that report, and what were actually a very modest series of proposals as to things that could be done in relation to tax policy and other policies, and the kind of violent reaction to that, to see how deeply a certain brand of rentierism is now saturates the UK, not just in terms of the corporate class, but kind of households more generally as well. And I think that is a big obstacle. Even if things could be done in such a way, and I'm sure this is true, even if things could be done in such a way where the kind of penalisation of rents would be primarily of corporate rents, the selling of that, the communication of that is a whole other problem. And Martin Wolf, amongst many others, he's written some really nice stuff about how speculation in land rents is almost is stitched into the national psyche within the UK, and you trespass on that, or at least you're perceived to trample on that at your political peril.
I was just thinking that there's also the sort of broader macroeconomic kind of bind, which is some of the policies which you haven't really talked about, but I think sort of mentioned it. Well, you have talked about them a bit in relation to things like QE. Effectively, neoliberalism means excluding asset prices from how you calculate inflation, and therefore interest rates come down to effectively zero, and that's a policy that is benefiting both the house price, the home owning rentier, and those who are operating in some of these other kind of more sort of corporate style rentier models. So in a sense, that kind of ultra low interest rate economy is one that in some ways kind of provides us a shared interest between the big corporate and the little kind of sort of petty bourgeois version of it. Let me just I want to kind of, if I may, I want to pull together a couple of questions, because two people have brought up higher education, which are Sherif and Andrew Lation, in slightly different ways. I mean, the first question is, how do UK higher education institutions fit into this equation? And then Andrew's question is, to what extent might education qualify as part of the rentier economy? I think, I mean, in terms of the way he says it facilitates opportunity hoarding and facilitates access to high-paying and or powerful career. I suppose the common thread there is that universities have been encouraged since the 90s to view themselves as themselves a bundle of assets that they can sell access to as a basis from which to people to invest in their own sort of human capital value for the market. But does higher education kind of fit into this? It's a bit of a sort of it's not your obvious example, but it's interesting how two people both thought of this.
It's a good question, and I must confess it's not one that I've given any thought to at all. Certainly, higher education doesn't feature in the book at all. I mean, I guess the obvious way in which it could and potentially should feature in the kind of taxonomy that I talk about is the fact that many higher education institutions are obviously quite significant property rentiers in their own right, and I know that that's become a source of quite contention in recent months during the coronavirus pandemic. But if you consider that the kind of property ownership and the property rentier aspect of what higher education institutions do as being relatively marginal to their core business, is their core business, can that be usefully conceptualized in terms of rent? I actually haven't given that any thought at all, and I'm not going to kind of hazard a speculative and undoubtedly groundless answer to that question.
I tell you, if you were stuck inside the UK higher education sector, you'd probably be thinking about it night and day. But
yeah.
I mean, it's partly a symptom of the extent to which we're encouraged to think of ourselves in these terms. I think that after a while it sort of seeps into your consciousness. Could I now ask Christine? I'm sort of jumping around, but Christine's got a different sort of, I think, coming from a different angle again, and I think it's important that we hear this. Christine, would you like to ask your question yourself? Otherwise, I can read it out.
Sure, will do, yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, yes. Perfectly.
Great, okay. Thank you for a fantastic book, fantastic research. So I was thinking about rentier capitalist states within a global neoliberal order and how you see those, and whether we could think about them as acting in an imperialist manner, thinking about colonialism and so on, whether we could think about it in a way of the center extracting value from the periphery. So specifically, I'm thinking of sort of land grabbing or, sweatshops and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm gonna say a few things in response to that. So the first thing to say is that there is that kind of geography in the book in terms of, I definitely point out, as I'm sure you've noticed, that in certain sectors, predominantly natural resources, finance, and intellectual property, a very, very large proportion of the rents that are earned by UK-based corporate rentiers are being earned overseas, and in many cases, the assets that are generating those rents are internationally based, not least a lot of the natural resource reserves that are controlled by the likes of BP and Shell. Very limited amounts of those assets are UK based. So a lot of that rent is being earned overseas. That's the first thing I say. The second thing to say is, the question of the extent to which that can or should be thought of in terms of kind of an imperialist or colonialist dynamic is not one I look at in detail in the book. To the extent that I look about it, I do very little more than pointing out that you can only understand why a lot of those assets are still controlled by UK institutions, even though they're located overseas, and why those rents continue to be extracted from overseas in the context of colonial and imperial history. So I look at it from that kind of historical angle, without kind of theorizing or conceptualizing it in terms of imperialist or colonialist dynamics. However, what I would say is that if if you chose to think about rent in terms of this kind of as a form of value extraction rather than a form of value creation, which kind of goes back to where I started the discussion, Will, in terms of kind of productive versus unproductive economic activities, then I think that would naturally lead you down that path. And certainly, I think if you look at someone like Michael Roberts, for example, he would describe the UK as a rentier economy, not so much in the way I do, which is an economy structured around the generation of rent. He would say it's a rentier economy because the income that it earns is precisely being extracted from overseas through these kind of colonial or imperialist relationships. So I don't do that in the book, but I think it's very much a conceptual theoretical lens that one could apply.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try and take a couple more, and I'm going to bundle a couple together. There were a couple of questions in the chat. One from Stefan about, is it possible even to imagine a kind of non-rentier capitalism? But then there's also another question further down from Ben saying, how important do you think the decline of organised labour has been? And the connection between the two is that Stefan says, I would argue that pre-Thatcher rents from lack of competition did equally exist, but they were shared with unionised, i.e. rentier labour, in the sense that if we think of capitalist production as a process of extraction, first and foremost, then the question is how many rentiers can actually sit around the table together and in a sense share the spoils. So how important is organised labour in all of this?
Yeah,
I mean, obviously it's important to neoliberalism, and that story's been told many times. But do unions feature in the book?
So unions do not feature in the book, or at least they only figure in the book tangentially. So again, one of the arguments I make, so going back to one of the things I was talking about earlier about rentierism and income inequality, is that the rentier economy is one where precisely because it's an economy dominated by, in each sector, by a relatively few number of large corporations. Those corporations tend to wield a very significant amount of power in labor markets, and so it's a very monopolistic economy, as the economists like to put it. Hang on a second, I just need to close something. And so the history and trajectory of organised labour is part of that, but it's not one I specifically talk about at length in the book. But it's part of the same story, obviously, towards the generation of greater levels of income inequality in terms of the capital versus labour income share. So I talk about that, but I bracket off the history of organised labour there, even though it's clearly part of this. Going to the related question. Sorry?
Do you know who ate the pasta in the fridge?
Ooh. Someone needs to mute. Someone needs to mute their account. It's
fine. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Keep going.
Yeah. In terms of where the beginning of that question, in terms of kind of what a non-rentier economy would even look like, that's something I've kind of grappled with quite a lot. Piketty makes the argument. I'm not sure the extent to which I agree with him, but he makes the argument which I draw in the book, which is that capitalism kind of tends towards rentierism. I think he calls rent capital's logical destination, or he puts it something like that. So he basically makes the argument that however entrepreneurial different sectors of the economy or different capitalist economies start out, they tend towards rent over time. So that's one thing that Piketty argues. I think the other thing to point out is that there are lots of sectors of the economy where, and I think this is a key part of the story in terms of the very possibilities of a non-rentier economy, where you have large sectors of the economy where companies used to carry out various sets of activities themselves, but where so much of that activity has been hived off towards these kind of contract rentiers. And I think that's where a big part of the kind of lack of possibilities of a non-rentier economy is concentrated now, which is the fact that you've had this creation of this whole kind of new rentier domain through contracting out, which is obviously not just about rent, but I definitely believe that a huge part of it is about rent. And so when you have an economy where outsourcing has become the modus operandi, where both government but also companies themselves hive off everything that can be hived off, I think getting from that situation to a situation which can be meaningfully thought of as kind of non-rentierist in meaningful degree is actually quite challenging.
We're going to have just a final question, which I'm going to ask Duncan McCann if he's with us to ask. But before I do, I mean, I think because we haven't really quite got on some of the policy recommendations and how you undo some of this, and there is quite a lot of it in the book, including, and I'm thinking maybe Duncan's question might allow you to talk a bit about this, including some questions of how one might have a sort of collectivized rentier system that actually people like Mark Blythe and various others have, and obviously people like Guy Standing and so on have been recommending. So perhaps you could roll into Duncan McCann's question or your answer to it, some of the possible recommendations for the extent to which you can actually work within the existing system and to what extent you actually need to kind of design some new ones. Duncan, are you with us? Otherwise, I can ask it. Duncan's question is, how important, this is one I'm not entirely sure I understand it, but I think this is what it's getting at. How important is ownership in addressing the problem? Meaning, do solutions look to change who owns what, or can we leave ownership the same and change the rules with taxes and that sort of thing? Which I think does get to a sort of almost an ordo-liberal question about, do you need to kind of reshape the very framework of your economy, or can you kind of leave it as it is and sort of tinker with incentives and fiscal policy?
Yeah, very, very good question, and a good one to end on. So, you know, as well as competition law, so antitrust, the two of the other areas I talk about as, you know, potential areas for progressive policy of various kinds at the end of the book are precisely taxation. You know, taxation is a key issue, but also ownership. And I basically make the argument that you know, de-rentierizing the economy would absolutely require some degree of ownership transformation, and the argument I make in the book is that what probably isn't the best way of thinking about it is in terms of kind of a necessary switch simply from private ownership back to public ownership. If on the one hand we have, and I think we do, you know, the UK does have the idea that kind of, you know, private ownership is almost by definition currently the preferred form of ownership, at least as the powers that be see it. I think it would be wrong to kind of just reverse that and say, well, everything should be owned by the public sector. What I argue in the book is that, you know, probably the best outcome that at least has some chance of being put in place is more likely to be some kind of mixed ecology where absolutely some assets remain privately owned. Some housing, for example, a lot of housing can and probably should remain privately owned. And absolutely, there are some assets that would be better off in the public sector, whether that's owned by the national government or whether it's owned by by local government, by municipalities, whether that's various forms of energy infrastructure or whatever else it might be. But there are other assets still that maybe should be thinking not in terms of private ownership or state ownership, but in terms of collective ownership. You know, land being one example, but not the only example. So that's the case that I kind of try to tentatively make in the book, is that absolutely ownership transformation is very, very important. Getting away from this idea of private ownership as the default ownership status for assets of any kind, towards, as I say, a kind of a mixed ecology where you have some assets being privately owned, some being owned communally, but then also some being owned by the state, whether that's nationally or locally.
Again, I'm doing it again. I'm such an amateur at this. So I think we're going to wrap things up there, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for the questions. Sorry for those whose questions didn't get chosen. There's huge amounts to discuss here. It's a terrific book. I recommend it strongly. Rentier Capitalism: Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It. So thank you very much, Brett Christophers, for joining this afternoon.
Thanks, Will. And thanks everyone for attending.
Bye-bye, everyone.